much, Levi, Annette, Katrina, the whole remarkable Lantos family, Yigal Carmon. It's a singular honor to be asked to speak at this event. Tom Lantos was my friend, my mentor, my hero, my inspiration. And MEMRI, brilliantly led by Yigal Carmon, is a critically important institution with which I've been associated for many years and whose 24/7 blanket objective coverage of the Arab and Muslim media is an indispensable tool for governments around the world, for policymakers and citizens seeking to better understand the direction of the Arab and Muslim world. I first met Tom and Annette when Tom volunteered to work with me in the 1976 Jimmy Carter presidential campaign, taking a leave of absence from his professorship at San Francisco State University. He played an important role in placing human rights in the forefront of the administration's foreign policy after the election. And we became very close personal friends. I remember Tom and Annette coming to our home for a Shabbat dinner when our kids were still very young, and knowing of my love for basketball, brought basketballs as presents for our two boys. We became great admirers of the whole family, watching their remarkable daughters, Annette and Katrina, grow into wonderful women and leaders in their own right, and the remarkable children and grandchildren that they've fostered. Tom's personal history from our first meeting really inspired my work during the Clinton administration years later, and even during the Carter administration, when my memorandum to the president led to the creation of a presidential commission headed by Elie Wiesel to propose the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And that museum is a testament, really, to Tom and to his life, and indeed, appropriately, because of his leadership in Congress, the 15th Street side of the museum is named the Raoul Wallenberg Way. As the only Holocaust survivor ever elected to Congress, Tom brought a sense of mission to his work, supporting human rights around the world. And I think it's fair to say that during his 17 years in the House of Representatives, no single member had a greater impact nor endeared himself more to his colleagues on both sides of the aisle than Tom. During those years, his work with MEMRI was also legendary, because MEMRI provided the materials which Tom depended on to combat anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, not simply by words but by deed, because it was Tom's legislation against anti-Semitism, fed again by the information from MEMRI, that led to the 2004 Global Anti-Semitism Review Act, which called for the monitoring and combating of anti-Semitism and established an office within the State Department, ironically within the State Department, which I served for many years, because it was the State Department's inaction which led to many Jewish refugees being unable to find safety on these shores. But in this office, there is now a special representative on combating anti-Semitism, now ably headed by Hannah Rosenthal, our special envoy to combat and monitor anti-Semitism. And this is the only country in the world in which there is a major senior figure devoted solely to monitoring and combating anti-Semitism. That speaks well of this country, but it speaks well of Tom's leadership as well. I want to talk to you today about a new form of anti-Semitism. But before I do, we can't leave the more traditional forms either, because they continue to rear their ugly head in Europe, as Katrina mentioned. What is perhaps different from the time in the pre-World War II and World War II eras is that now, as a result of Tom's leadership and of the elevation of the issue of anti-Semitism, leaders take action. For example, France has made anti-Semitic acts a punishable hate crime. Under Tony Blair, the UK established a special commission, the McShane Commission, to review the scourge of anti-Semitic acts occurring against school children in Great Britain. And Germany, for decades, has made Holocaust denial a crime. So that while traditional anti-Semitism has by no means been erased, it has at least been combated. And let me, again, before I go to the heart of what I want to say, I want to talk for a minute about the Holocaust, because when we see the contributions that Tom and Annette have made, it makes us realize what was lost by the 6 million who did not survive, by the 1.5 million kids who never had a chance to make their mark on the world. There were 17 million Jews in the world in 1939, at a time the world had 2 billion people. There are 13.5 million today in a world of 7 billion. And if we're fortunate, there will be maybe 14 or 15 million in a world of 10 billion by mid-century. The Holocaust didn't spring from thin air. It didn't come simply from the hands of a few Nazi madmen. It was the culmination of centuries of bigotry, discrimination, mob violence, separate housing, separate clothing, loss of job opportunities, dreadful pogroms, blaming calamities like the Black Plague in the Middle Ages. All of this preceded the Holocaust. But I want to stress now a new form of anti-Semitism, aimed at delegitimizing Israel as a Jewish state, with Jews worldwide as targets and surrogates for anger and violence against Israel. This is different from the anti-Semitism religious base which Annette and Tom faced in Hungary and which almost took their lives. This anti-Semitism is cloaked as anti-Zionism, and it takes many different forms. Radical groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, directly supported by Iran, seek nothing short than the violent elimination of a Jewish state in the Middle East and view Jews worldwide as acceptable targets. This can be seen, for example, in the destruction of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires and of EMEA, the Argentine Jewish Community Center, in the 1990s. More recently, the 2008 attack on the Chabad Lubavitch House in Mumbai by Pakistani militants against Indian targets, and the tragic death, even this year, of a teacher and 3 children at a Jewish school in Toulouse, France. There are major elements of Muslim society, from the leadership of the Palestinian Authority to the monarchies of the Gulf, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, willing to live at peace with Israel, and yet even they support unremitting UN resolutions against Israel, far out of proportion to those against serial human rights violators. More than half of all the resolutions condemning human rights violations passed by the UN Human Rights Council are against the state of Israel, which has a viable democracy and is not a human rights violator at all. This insidious form of new anti-Semitism employs symbols and images and language equating Zionism and racism, as occurred in the Durban Conference, suggesting that Israel practices apartheid, depicting Israeli soldiers with Nazi swastikas. And this new anti-Semitism has now been adopted in different forms by some European labor unions, calling for boycotts of Israeli products, Palestinian advocates on college campuses, and some academics. They cross the line from legitimate criticism of Israel, which all states must be subject, and seek to undermine the very foundation of a Jewish state within any borders. I've had some personal experiences with this. As Undersecretary of State, I traveled to Cairo to talk about a variety of economic issues, but I took the occasion to meet with then Foreign Minister Amr Moussa, later head of the Arab League and a candidate for the presidency just a few months ago. And I presented to him, with the permission of the Secretary of State and the State Department a series of grossly anti-Israel cartoons in Al-Haram, the official state newspaper, depicting Israeli soldiers with Nazi emblems, distorted anti-Semitic characteristics, crushing poor Palestinians. And I presented them to the foreign minister, and I said, Mr. Minister, you are, at that time, the only state in the Arab world with a peace treaty with Egypt, with Israel. This is undermining the very basis of that treaty and teaching your people the very wrong lessons. Ah, he said, we have a free press in Egypt. We can't deal with that. A few years later, as vice president of Freedom House, we met with the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the United States and presented to him copies of the curriculum of the Saudi educational system, which are in the most gross terms anti-Christian and anti-Jewish, talking about Jews and Christians as being dogs and with other vile allegations. He agreed these were unacceptable and said he would change the school curriculum of the school under his direction in Northern Virginia. While there had been some modest changes, much of that language remains. Now, it is necessary to be careful when one uses the term anti-Semitism. It is a highly loaded term. If it is used too often, it debases real anti-Semitism. And so we must distinguish between legitimate criticism of Israel, which, like any modern state, is appropriate. But we must make sure that we understand the difference between that criticism and delegitimization. Perhaps the best test for that was presented by Natan Sharansky, now head of the Jewish Agency, of course, a famous Soviet refusenik, and a former Israeli cabinet officer. In what he calls the 3 Ds, is Israel being demonized by having its actions blown out of proportion? For example, falsely comparing Israeli actions to those of Nazis, and Palestinian refugee camps to Auschwitz. Second, is there a double standard in which Israel is treated differently from other countries, for example, being singled out, as I've mentioned, by the UN Human Rights Council for human rights abuses, while Iran and Syria, Sudan, and Zimbabwe are left untouched? Is the attack an effort to undermine the very legitimacy of a Jewish state and to deny that legitimacy? Well, there can be no doubt on which side of the line a speech given only 2 weeks ago by the vice president of Iran, on which side that lies. In a Tehran conference sponsored by the UN on June 25th, the Iranian Vice President Mohammad Reza Rahmani said that the Talmud, a central text of Judaism, was responsible for the spread of illegal drugs which the conference was designed to deal with. Second in line to President Ahmadinejad, himself a serial Holocaust denier, including before the UN General Assembly, said, and I quote, "The Talmud teaches to destroy everyone who opposes the Jews, that Zionists are in firm control of the illegal international drug traffic, and that also gynecologists were taking orders to kill black babies on the order of Zionists." And yet, I want to close on a more hopeful note. MEMRI has found some signs of less virulent anti-Israel rhetoric by Saudi Arabia. King Abdullah has convened a conference with Jewish and Christian clerics calling for religious tolerance. In 2002 and restated thereafter, the Saudi peace plan, now adopted by the Arab League, calls for full normalization with the Jewish state, albeit with several unacceptable conditions. The secondary boycott of Israel has been eviscerated, beginning, if I may say, by legislation that President Carter proposed and that Tom Lantos helped champion and that I helped draft, outlawing U.S. participation in the Arab boycott of Israel. And Israel has recently been selected to the major organization of industrial democracies, the OECD. And old-fashioned European anti-Semitism, as I've indicated, is more marginalized, and when it happens, it is attacked. And when Ahmadinejad denied the Holocaust at the UN, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon himself said this was an unacceptable statement. Over 2,500 years ago, the prophet Jeremiah had a vision following the destruction of the first temple. He said, "I will gather them from the utmost parts of the world, the blind and the lame among them, women with child and women in travail. A company shall come back there." 2,500 years later, this has been achieved by Israel and more. The empires which sought to destroy the Jewish people, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, the Greeks and the Romans, the Nazis who tried to destroy all Jewish civilization, and in fact destroyed 2/3 of the flower of European Jewry, almost taking the lives also of Tom and Annette. And the communist empire have all vanished, while the indomitable, indestructible Jewish people thrives and will continue to make contributions to the world far beyond our small numbers, both in the Jewish state of Israel and outside. This, to me, is the greatest gift and the greatest testament to the work that Tom Lantos has done and that Annette and his two daughters continue to do. And may all of you go, and MEMRI as well, from strength to strength. Thank you.